According to some estimates, the United States has about 600 military installations overseas, and since 2017 it's fought in 76 different countries. Is it time to roll back the American empire? So in our last video we talked about Robert Kagan and his idea that the United States should expand its authority across the world and reinforce American power internationally. This time we're going to look at the work of Harvard professor Stephen Walt and his latest book, The Hell of Good Intentions, which argues the United States should take a much more hands-off approach towards the rest of the world. So you may have heard of Stephen Walt. He is, by some estimations, pretty much as close as one can get to being a celebrity if you're an international relations scholar. He became particularly famous in recent years because of a somewhat controversial book that he wrote about the US Israel lobby with a fellow academic named John McCain. But we're not going to talk about that book today, but if you're interested, maybe leave me a comment down below. So Walt defines himself as a neo-realist, which contrasts with Kagan, who is sometimes referred to as a neo-conservative, which may be a branch of neoliberalism. If you're getting a bit sick of all these neo-neos, maybe I'll do a video on those at some point too. Whoa. Suffice to say, as a neo-realist, Walt argues that the prevailing wisdom that directs US foreign policy is deeply flawed.
How did we get here? There was, as Chris said, tremendous optimism when the Cold War ended, but that's not the world we're living in today. The United States deserves a lot of the blame.
And it's flawed in Walt's view because of what it aims for, putting the United States on top of what he calls
liberal hegemony. The strategy is liberal, not in the sense of being left-wing, but because it seeks to use American power to defend and spread the traditional liberal principles of individual freedom, rule of law, democratic government, market-based economics.
He says that the US pays too much and gains too little to make it really worthwhile. That might sound familiar.
But we can't continuously have other nations taking advantage of the United States.
However, Walt distances himself from Trump and just argues that Trump has been capitalizing on a common assumption in Americans.
Over time, the view that elites in many parts of the West were out of touch with the rest of society made it possible for populists like Donald Trump to rise to power.
So what's the big idea here? Well, for Walt, US foreign policy has suffered so many failures over the past 3 decades because foreign policy leaders have pursued a whole series of very unwise and unrealistic objectives, and they've refused to learn from mistakes that they've made. And they've been enabled in doing that by the US's overwhelming primacy, its geographical invulnerability, its massive military superiority, but the community itself has become dysfunctional and has become a sort of a self-replicating process whereby the same ideas are simply produced and reproduced and no competing thought, no alternative ideas are allowed in. Big focus of his is on identifying and pointing the finger at this foreign policy community, this network of institutions and individuals circulate around decision makers. So describing this community, he borrows a phrase from Ben Rhodes, one of President Obama's foreign policy advisors, who calls it the blob.
And when I said the blob, what I was referring to is kind of a groupthink, that the way in which we solve a problem is by bombing a country.
First, it's the formal institutions of government, obviously. Second, you have a vast array of what I would call membership organizations. Then there's, of course, think tanks. And then we have, of course, because it's America, lots of interest groups and lobby. The media, of course, is part of this. And then last but not least, academia.
And it's the kind of place where, as long as you know the right people and you say the right thing, you don't really need to worry about any other kind of qualifications.
There's no required degree, no bar exam, no medical board certification. You need a real estate license to sell real estate, but not to practice foreign policy.
So as Walt says, aspiring foreign policy gurus need only establish a close relationship with a successful politician or acquire a solid reputation among establishment figures within some part of the existing community. So how does the blob wield its influence? Using the example of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Walt identifies a 3-step progress through which the blob asserts its influence. So the first step is to elevate the threat.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
The second step is to hype the benefits.
Great news, everybody! Democracy just kicked in!
And the third step is to conceal the costs.
But there's no doubt in my mind that we will prevail, and there's no doubt in my mind once these people are gone that we will be welcomed as liberators.
So what's Steve Walt's alternative to all this? Well, he promotes an idea called offshore balancing, and essentially what this means is rolling back America's interests to the bare minimum and pursuing a policy of balance of power around the world.
Again, it's not isolationism, it's suggesting you have to look at the configurations of power in the world and figure out where the United States needs to focus most of its attention.
In essence, the United States would not try and impose its values on the rest of the world or govern any kind of liberal hegemony. It would look after its own interests, but in so doing it would seek to prevent any other single power or any combination of powers rising to the status of a regional hegemon. And in so doing, the United States would maintain its position of primacy without worrying too much about the challenges from any opposing power.
Offshore balancers think three regions might be worth fighting to defend: Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Persian Gulf. These are areas that contain either concentrations of industrial power or, in the case of the Persian Gulf, energy resources.
So what do we think of offshore balancing? Well, I've been a big fan of Steve Walt's work for a long time, and I think part of his advantage is that because he's outside the mainstream, although I think the amount he goes on about being an outsider is a bit overblown given that he's a professor at Harvard University.
I don't need backups. I'm going to Harvard.
He's often a critic of American foreign policy when it's at its most absurd, so he enjoys the advantage of being able to point out the absurdities of American foreign policy.
It's obvious in the wake of 9/11 and the Iraq War that something had gone badly awry in U.S. Middle East policy.
But is his alternative really that convincing? He argues that one example of effective offshore balancing is American foreign policy in the Middle East before the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
But notice, in the Cold War, the United States acted like an offshore balancer in the Middle East. We had strategic interests there, but we did not deploy significant ground or air forces until Iraq seized Kuwait and threatened the local balance of power in 1990.
But during this period, when it was working so well, of course there were some terrible events that took place. For instance, the Iran-Iraq War, which took up almost all of the decade of the 1980s and killed hundreds of thousands of people on both sides. The United States played the role of offshore balancer in this conflict, supporting one side and then supporting the other side. And Henry Kissinger famously said, "It's a shame that both sides can't lose."
Well, I'll let you know if your glasses turn up.
No one must know I dropped them in the toilet.
In some ways they did, and a lot of people died as a result, many of them innocent. So wouldn't offshore balancing, if it was really taken to this global scale, simply leave open the role of any kind of moral leadership? Wouldn't this make it more likely for more mass atrocities to take place, like the Rwandan genocide?
Over the course of just 100 days, about 800,000 people were slaughtered in Rwanda by ethnic Hutu extremists.
Or the ethnic cleansing in Bosnia-Herzegovina? Haven't we seen exactly the kind of dangerous products of the abdication of leadership in, for instance, Syria and Yemen and Myanmar, just in recent years, where there's been nobody taking any kind of moral leadership role? Oh, don't get me wrong, I've never been an advocate for enthusiastic American intervention around the world. I've often found the arguments in the run-up to war sickening.
When I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons.
And infuriating.
What changed last night?
I think Donald Trump became President of the United States. I think this was actually a big moment.
In exactly the ways that Walt identifies. But just because America isn't a good moral leader doesn't mean there isn't a need for anybody to stand up for morality around the world. Or else, what do we have left? A very dangerous world where, granted, America's interests will be served, but what about the rest of us? Anyway, let me know what you think. Does Walt's critique convince you? What about his alternative perspective? Leave comments down below and let me know your thoughts. If you've liked this video, please click the like button. If you've loved it, please subscribe, and I'd be really grateful if you could pass it along to anybody else who might be interested. See you next time.